Hi there, it's Ian here, and you're watching Grumpy Opinions, the show where I'm going to tell you all about what I think of films, TV shows, games, and life in general. Let's get on with the show. Catch-22 is a new show from Hulu, and it's now also on Channel 4, starring Christopher Abbott and George Clooney, and telling a broad satirical story of the horrors of war and bomber crews during the Mediterranean campaign, based on one of the most famous books. And if you're new to the channel, please subscribe and follow me on Twitter on @GrumpyOpinions. And you can check out my back catalogue as well as this show, Game of Thrones, Outlander, Handmaid's Tale, and Star Trek Discovery. And there's going to be more things coming up. Episode 6 opens shortly after where we left last week, but Yoyo's landed his parachute and he got caught in a tree. And once he's down, he hides from US soldiers, and then he gets to a big Italian house where the kindly locals manage to explain that his injuries aren't actually that bad, and he's going to get his solar undercarriage all sewn up. And after that, he enjoys the hospitality and the company of the cute daughter who lives there, and that annoys her dad a wee bit, and soon enough, they call the army and they come up to bring him home despite his protestations. And of course, once he's back, the doc and the nurse take a look, and well, it seems there isn't a real problem. And that doesn't help him much, so, he tells the colonels his balls were blown off, and then they send him back to Dr. Nika, who finally agrees to, kind of bend the truth a wee bit to it, but the general isn't having it. And after a very close inspection of the offending and quite undamaged pods, Yoyo's back to work and flying missions. And sure enough, it is back to normal, and they've got yet another new green recruit, a guy called Snowden. And Yoyo tells him to stay out of the tail gunner turret because of what happened to Natalie and just relax. So, when they get to the mission, they're about to drop the bombs and everything, and then they get hit by flak. And Yoyo heads back to see what's going on, and he finds the poor boy in shock, and he's got a leg wound. So he calmly talks to him and he bandages him up. And the guy says he's cold, and then Yoyo's a bit concerned, but he shouldn't be too bad. And then he moves him, and he sees his great gaping holes behind him in the plane, and in Snowden. And then when he unzips his jacket, he sees that his whole body's been ripped to shreds. And as they land, Yossarian's had enough, and he breaks down a bit and strips naked and walks out the plane, just like we saw at the beginning of the series. And he kind of stays that way, and he stays that way all through Snowden's funeral. And then during the medal award service, where the general barely blinks an eye at it and actually ends up saluting him as a brave hero and quite happy for him not to wear his clothes. And Yoyo can only look up at the sky helplessly at the madness of it all. And next time we see him, he's sitting in his cockpit, calmly dropping bombs on yet another mission, sitting naked in his plane, happily resigned to the madness of it all. So what did I think? Well, we've reached the end of this fantastic limited series, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this episode first, and then get on to what I thought of the rest of what happened. Now, apologies for this taking so long. Yeah, there's been a bit of a break. You see, I got a little sidetracked over the summer because, I was very busy with my work and life and stuff. And to be honest, I got a wee bit depressed, and I kind of let this all slide. I mean, it just seemed like a big deal to try and finish this off. And that happened, but I'm getting it finished now. Even though, I already actually recorded the first part of it ages ago. Literally, the recap, I recorded months ago, around about the time that it aired. Anyway, so this week was surprising in a lot of ways for me, not just because it started off with that long drawn-out montage of Yoyo at the Italian house. I mean, it's been a little while since I read the book, but I don't remember this bit at all. What's more, it took up a fairly large chunk of this final episode. And I did like it. It was funny and it was gorgeous, and it reminded me massively of the whole segment in The Godfather where Michael goes to Sicily and ends up getting together with Apollonia and they hang out for a while, and it just really reminded me of that. It had that sort of theme. It was very much that kind of pastoral Italian countryside stuff, but nobody got blown up. I also liked that, we got a bit more of a few of the famous scenes from the book in this episode. We had the funeral scene and the medal scene. And both of them are famous for, Yoyo being naked, during what happens in them. And we also got, the infamous Snowden scene. And I really like how they chose to do it. It was kind of realistic and shocking without, resorting to, gore and horror. Now, yeah, the film, that did it differently. Yeah, I mentioned the film again. It was a little closer to the book, and it had, Snowden more delirious. And it kind of told that story over various, bits throughout the movie. It kept flashing back and showing you a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more of, that whole situation. Every time you went back, it would suddenly cut and Alan Arkin would be seen a bit more, and it would tie into whatever else was happening in the film. But it also showed the injury in horrible detail. I mean, not quite to the extent of the book. I mean, which made me, I remember not actually wanting to eat cooked tomatoes for at least a week after I read it, because it describes how that's what they had for breakfast and that spills out the side of them. And I really love that scene. It's great. I also really love the work with the actors like Abbott and Harrison Osterfield, who play Snowden. I mean, they really sell that terrifying moment between the two men, when they realise what's happened. And also that horrible moment when they come into land and Yoyo finally breaks down covered in blood and then goes walking out. But, a lot of this episode didn't quite work as well for me. Not in a terrible way, but in a kind of, that's a little bit underdone sort of way. I mean, a good solid block of this episode, the final episode of the show, was all about this shrapnel wound. Now, in the book, it never really happens like that. I mean, so it's kind of sort of new, and it felt a little bit like filler, because it was. And don't get me wrong, it was really funny. I mean, the stuff of like George Clooney examining Yoyo's scrotum with a pencil, and it's a fake, by the way. They said so in an interview. That's not really his actual testicles. But it also meant that the funeral scene and the medal scene, both of which, are massively important in the book and in the film version of it, here felt a little bit kind of perfunctory. I mean, take the medal scene. Now, it's not shot all that different, apart from like, the absurdity of it all is like cranked up to the nines a little bit. But I mean, in this version, we don't know General Dreedle, and it's implied by what happened that he's just as crazy as the rest of the officers in his own way, although it's a little bit unclear. And I like that you see like Cathcart and Corn smirking as Shyscoff gets told off by him, and it shows that the madness in bureaucracy is there for everybody, no matter how far up the ladder they are. There's always somebody above them who's even crazier. But the scene felt a little bit out of place, and it may be because of the structure of the show and because the book and the film had other scenes with Dreedle to like carry over. I mean, they did it really well. I mean, the film version of it, you actually have Orson Welles playing Dreedle, and he turns up variously, and that whole scene's done really quite cleverly. But I mean, the other biggie is the ending. And this isn't a grump so much as the fact that it's a difference between the way that the show is done and the adaptation as a whole. Because you see, the ending's very different from the book ending or the film ending. You see, in the book, and kind of in the film, Yo-Yo, like, when he's Rome, he actually makes it and manages to meet up with Clara and tells her that Nately's dead. And she gets the idea into her head that he's responsible, so she tries to kill him. And she keeps trying to kill him, and she ends up basically slashing at him at the end of the book. And in the film, she actually comes up and does a big nasty stab on him. That's right at the beginning of the movie, and you don't realize it's her until the end. But it's also a key factor in him realizing at the end, when he hears about Orr escaping to Sweden, that he can do the same thing. And in the book, he races out the door and he's planning to get like Clara's wee sister and take her back to Sweden, and so they can live a happy life away from the horrors of the war. I mean, nothing untoward, he just wants to look after her. And in the 1970s film, he just jumps out the window and he gets right in the nearest dinghy and starts rowing away because it's a bit more absurd. And here, he doesn't do any of that. He hears that Orr survived and he just kind of discounts it as probably not true, and he just flies more missions. Now, none of those endings really tells you what happened for sure. It's all left a little bit ambiguous. I mean, there is a sequel book called Closing Time. I've never actually gotten around to reading it because kind of I didn't want to spoil the memory of Catch-22, and also just because I never saw it in the shops anywhere, and just thought, oh, I'll just grab that now. But it's about the surviving characters, and I think it's set like 50 years later when they're all older men. But none of that Catch-22 versions, the adaptations, or like the original book, specifically tells you what happens, or whether this is just another scheme of Yo-Yo's that's going to fail. I mean, because if he gets away, even if he doesn't die, realistically, the war's only going to last for another, 6 months, maybe at most, maybe less. And that's where it gets interesting, because in every version of the story, he gets the chance to go home. And in the book and the film, he's told if he toes the line and sells war bonds and does all that jazz, that kind of PR stuff that the film Flags of Our Fathers was all about, and kind of gets touched on in Captain America and on the TV show The Pacific a little. Anyway, if he does that and ends up like making the colonels look good, he's free to like go and live his life and basically be a hero.
Say nice things about us. Tell the folks at home what a good job we're doing.
But he doesn't want to do that because he doesn't want to play the game. And in the TV show, like Yo-Yo has no problem with that. He's just happy about getting out alive, and that's kind of a major, 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 major deviation from the original. And it does suit this stripped back, sort of bleaker, more realistic version of the story. In a lot of ways, it kind of suits our modern times a wee bit better. In some sense, it actually makes sense that Yossarian, instead of trying to run away, he just accepts that he needs to buckle down and get it done, but doing so out of uniform, having his own little protest. And I read that kind of as him being absorbed into the system. He's found his own madness. He's found his way to survive and his craziness, just like everybody else. And, this Yo-Yo will probably end up joining up with Milo after the war as a partner and leave the war a rich man if he survives. And it's kind of a bitter ending. And it's a little bit of a hopeless ending, at least, from an idealistic point of view and a nonconformist point of view. And maybe that's just the world today. I mean, you see the original 60s and 70s versions of the film were born into the counterculture and during a time of like pointless war in a post-World War II world. And the only way to win was to escape from it all. Now, today, we live in a world so removed from like real war in the West that it makes more sense to end it with Yo-Yo protesting a system from within. And that's a good reading. On a bad one, it's him just giving up and becoming part of the machine that he hates. But Yo-Yo's a very different character in this than he was in the books, and I never felt like either adaptation fully gets across that sense of kind of ambivalence he fears. You see, there's like a larking sense in the original between the scenes of grim death, and there's a kind of boyish fun and daftness between all these young lads. And the show does have some scenes of them drinking and hanging out, but we never really see like the daft side of Yossarian. I mean, the closest we get is that little ice cream scene, and that's very short lived. I mean, another side of that is Yossarian in the book. I mean, he actually has relationships, or at least, he sleeps with several different girls. And that might have made him seem like a bit of a wee man slut in 2019. And the film only really has him, obviously try and fail to seduce Nurse Duckett, and then he has a longer, more meaningful flirt with like this Italian girl he meets. But in the TV show, we only see him with Mrs. Scheisskopf, and then he has like this kind of friendly platonic relationship with Nurse Duckett, and it's hard to really say exactly why that decision was made. I mean, I'm not entirely sure. As I said, could be the manslut thing, could be just to make us like him better, and we like him better if he's less happy. And maybe if he was in a good, solid relationship, he would just be happy and he wouldn't care. He'd just get on with things a bit more like like Nately. But overall, I think the show is kind of reflective of today more so than you might originally guess. I mean, we live in a time of governments doing daft things and leaders that seem bonkers. I mean, hell, I don't like to get political, but it's hard not to equate the whole Brexit farce with a lot of what happens on the show. And if, Yo-Yo reflects us, what does that say about the world today if the only sane man is one who has to act crazy just to get through the day? But in the end, I have to say, I really enjoyed this show. I think it holds up really well, and although it's a little bit padded feeling here and there, it's a far closer adaptation than the old movie was, which, as I've said all along, is really well worth watching if you enjoy the series. And obviously, the book itself is a classic. But for me, that's me done with this show. I hope everyone enjoyed my coverage of it. So until next time, on a new show, I've been Ian, and these have been my grumpy opinions.